my name is Angela Schumann and I am the Shakespeare Whisperer. Today in this video I am being joined by my PhD supervisor, Dr. Peter Groves, and we're filming here at Monash University. So what we want to do is a series on the play Measure for Measure. It's my favourite play. I have decided it's one of your favourite plays.
Oh, it is definitely. Yes.
Yeah, so we want to take you through a reading of the play. We're not going to read it through line by line, but we are going to work our way from start to finish discussing the various themes that interest us.
Exactly, yes. Among the which in particular will be questions about self-knowledge, because it's something new in Shakespeare in a way. This, not entirely new, but largely new in Western literature, this idea of the self as a kind of hidden pool within one, that one perhaps tries to peer into and doesn't always succeed in discovering what's in there. And that is very much predominant in the theme of this play. The three major characters of the play all suffer from the... the trouble is, it's a combination, because you can be uncertain about yourself and you can be ignorant of yourself, but when it's combined with a certain degree of complete self-confidence, an assurance that you do know exactly what kind of person you are and how you should behave to other people and so on, then that becomes dangerous and problematic. And the three main characters all exhibit this. Are you going to give a little précis of the plot, or?
Oh, you know what? You go ahead.
Okay. Well, the story is set in Vienna. And essentially it's about a young man called Claudio who, well, it's about the Duke first of all, and the Duke has decided to, we're not exactly sure why he's doing this, and we'll find out in the course of the play, but he decides to go off incognito and go among his people, which of course is a traditional motif from folk tales, from the Arabian Nights and that kind of thing. And very often what the ruler is doing when he does that is to see how his people are being, how they're taking his rule, if you like, so that they will be able to speak to him truthfully and directly and not in awe of his power and majesty and so on.
Which is something that we see in Henry V.
Exactly, well. Yes, he puts his cloak on it, and then gets very miffed when he's told a few home truths. He doesn't like it at all. There's a secondary motif here, which is quite interesting in the way it plays out in the play, which is that another reason that rulers in these folk tales put on their disguise is that they've fallen in love with a girl, or generally a girl, because it's generally a male ruler, of course, and they want to test her love. Does she love him merely for his power and his influence and his gold, or does she love him for himself? Which of course is a problematic concept, as W.B. Yeats, the Irish poet, once said, "Only God, my dear, can love you for yourself alone and not your yellow hair." So, but that's the idea. And we will find there are interesting echoes of this in the play itself, that Shakespeare knows about this tradition, is also using it. So he does this, he puts Angelo in charge, and Angelo is a young man, very skilled in the law, someone to whom law is a kind of beautiful intellectual construct, one that he kind of loves for it's like a mathematician. He's a bit kind of geeky, I suppose you would say, wouldn't you? he's not comfortable at parties. He sits in the corner sipping a sherry and goes as soon as possible. And he's not really a people person, I think we'd have to say. Contrasted with Aeschylus, who is his deputy while the Duke is away, that is Angelo's deputy, who is much more used to dealing with people and the knotty complexities of the actual operation of the law. And one of his first cases, first of all, the idea is that the Duke is doing this partly because he's been a bit lax, he's let things go to rack and ruin, and in particular, he hasn't been enforcing rules about sexual continence and so on. And this is an interesting metaphor in the play, because of course unruliness in terms of desire, and particularly sexual desire, is is a traditional sort of metaphor for social unruliness, the lower parts rising against the higher parts, you know. I don't. I was going to talk about St. Augustine and the male erection, but is that off limits here?
You know what? If it is relevant to the play, let's go there. We're here to learn.
Okay. Well, Augustine says very specifically that the uncontrollability of the male erection in fallen creatures like ourselves is a little joke on God's part, because it's a constant reminder that we are not in control even of our own bodies, let alone, you know, the world and everything around us. That we've forfeited that control. We forfeited that obedience from our body because of our disobedience to God. That's the idea behind it. So Angelo, of course, doesn't really. Angelo thinks that he's got all that under control. He's like a sort of very pious sixth former who's very, you know, he thinks that he's pure and noble, and he's way above all that sort of nasty sex stuff, you know, just got to touch him.
Very puritanical, I think. Angelo, Puritan.
Yes, very much so. He's called the precise Angelo, and that, of course, is code for Puritan in Elizabethan English. And one of the cases that come before him is the case of Claudio, who has got what's called a hand fasting with his wife, his spouse, Juliet, which means that really they're kind of 95% married. They just haven't been to church. But in legal terms, they have a kind of marriage bond, which in fact Shakespeare himself had with his own wife, Anne Hathaway. So that what this does is legitimate any issue. So, for example, Shakespeare's first child was born 6 months after their actual church wedding, but more than 9 months after their hand fasting. Technically called a sponsalia per verbo dei presenti, literally a marriage in terms of words spoken about the present moment. So you plight your troth. You say, you know, Angela, I intend to marry you, and there's a witness, and you reciprocate that, and we are married. Improbable as that might seem.
It's a kind of a common law marriage, and then the official church marriage takes place later on.
Exactly. Now, the law that's come in is very hard and fast and punishes, and Shakespeare's audience would have seen this as quite grotesque in any case, punishes any form of fornication with death, with execution. So Angelo is very keen to execute Claudio for fornication, but Claudio enlists his sister, who is not yet a nun, she's a novice. She hasn't taken orders yet. For all sorts of reasons, which we shall see, he thinks she'll be very persuasive. So she comes along and tries to persuade Angelo. And Angelo, well, again, we'll see what happens, but Angelo becomes attracted to her, let's put it that way. And eventually, it's a kind of story of a fall, very much a kind of fall in terms of Angelo himself. Because his name suggests angel, of course, and by that sin fell the angels. Angelo engineers a kind of deal with her, whereas if she will sleep with him, he will let Claudio off and not execute him. And we don't need to take the plot much beyond that at this stage. But of course, remember, the Duke is in the background, he's watching, he's keeping notes, because it seems, always had his suspicions about Angelo. And that's basically how the play unfolds from there. And of course it all ends, well, happily.
Well, I mean, it's a comedy, so we know that with tragedies everybody dies at the end, and with comedies everybody gets married at the end. So this is technically a comedy, however it's often called a tragicomedy or a problem comedy because it's much more complex than a happy ending, and it's a lot darker than that beneath the surface.
Absolutely, and in fact just about all the marriages that are proposed at the end of this play are a ghastly prospect. One way or another.
One of the reasons that I love this play and that it is my favourite play is that, you know, the plot that you've just described, it seems very straightforward. Angelo, this Puritan, thought he was perfect and completely in control of himself, and we see his fall, and we see him now, you know, threaten this young woman and go against everything that he said he was. And so we look at that and we say, haha, there's the bad guy, he didn't know himself, he's fallen, he's a hypocrite. But what we notice if we read the play closely is that other characters around him who seem to be heroes are actually just as deceived about themselves. And if we're not careful, they will deceive us too, and we will fall for them.
Exactly.
So it's something we can watch out for.
Exactly. Shakespeare doesn't have baddies and goodies on the whole. He has complex people, essentially.
Yeah, which is what makes his character so relatable
Yes,
so many
exactly.
hundreds of years later.
Exactly so.
All right, shall we
Shall
jump
we
in?
begin?
Okay.
So the first scene is basically the Duke giving commissions to Angelo, who's going to be number one, even though he's a young man, and Aeschylus, who will be his second in command, if you like, and explain that he's now nicking off, and not really explaining why he's doing this to them, or indeed giving them really any very precise notion of exactly what the limits of their authority are.
Oh, if I may say as well before we get started,
Please do.
we're both using the different Arden editions. So there are many different editions of the play that you can get. There are Penguin ones that most people have heard of. There are also some more scholarly ones. So we prefer the Arden edition because they have so many footnotes. So if you want to see my first page here, it's got about the first 4 lines, and then all the rest of it is explanatory notes, which you don't have to read, but they're very, very useful in explaining what's going on. So we recommend these editions of the play.
That's right.
And you can get them pretty cheap online, secondhand.
And if you're going to do any serious study of the play, you need something like this. This, by the way, is the second edition. You can see it's rather held together with sealing wax and packing tape.
Love.
It's right. Because I have had this, as I was telling Angela, about 50 years, this particular copy. So it's no longer really, it's not viable, but I can put notes in it, and I like it. I'm hanging on to it. But the point about these editions, incidentally, since we're talking about this, is that they don't like some simpler editions, say for students, tell you what to think. They don't simply give you an explanation. They give you the tools to arrive at your own conclusions. They explain, customs and words and things that might otherwise be obscure. So they don't kind of generally ram an interpretation down your throat. They liberate you they give you the knowledge to arrive at your own complex interpretation, which is what you want, really. You don't want somebody's second hand. Now it's
Reading of the play.
Well, that's right. Although it's good to have that, because then you can think, that's true, and that's not true. Or you can respond to it, you can react to it. You don't just have to accept it, is I think the point. So.
All right.
Okay, so he begins by calling Aeschylus to him. And I want to begin, we're not going to do this, we're not going to look at every single line in the play, but openings are often very important. They're very important in any writer, novelist, playwright. And the Duke's first line is rather odd. Of government the property is to unfold would seem in me to affect speech and discourse, he says to Aeschylus. Now, of government the property to unfold is a very odd word order. It's what we call an inversion, which gives it what we call the high style. It's highly formal. Nobody would ever say that in speech. You wouldn't say for dinner the preparation to make. I will go into the kitchen. You would look a bit silly. So you think to yourself, well, sometimes Shakespeare, other writers do this for the meter. It won't, the ordinary phrasing won't fit the meter. That's not true, though, because to say to unfold the properties of government is perfectly metrical. The rhythm is fine. So there must be some other reason for this, and in fact, what it's doing is what the Duke is saying is that if I start blathering onto you, who are well versed in these matters about the science of government, it would look as I was just wanting to big myself up and just listen to the sound of my own voice and be important and pompous. But he's doing exactly that by beginning in this pompous, elevated way. So it beautifully, subtly and delicately points us to, it's kind of like striking the first note in this theme of a complete lack of self-knowledge. He just doesn't understand himself. And
Pompously denies
his
his
pomposity.
own pomposity.
Exactly, which is beautiful. We've got a little conundrum as we open here, because he praises Aeschylus. He says, Aeschylus, you're wonderful, you know all about this stuff, you're just obviously the best man for the job, but I'm not going to give it to you. I'm going to give it to the untried Angelo. And he doesn't seem to have a lot of confidence in Angelo. He says, call hither, I say, bid come before us, Angelo. This is line 15. What figure of us think you he will bear? What figure of us, like a sort of a scarecrow or something?
And when he's saying us, does he mean himself?
Oh yes, he's talking like the ruler.
Yes, because the Duke's about to leave, and so Angelo will be taking on his place.
Exactly.
As the new ruler.
That's right. The ruler talks about us because he has two bodies. He's got a fleshly body subject to decay, and he's got a spiritual body which is eternal. And the two coalesce in this ruler, and then of course the spiritual body simply pops up again in the next ruler, so the king never dies. The king is dead, long live the king.
Yeah.
We need to remember, I mean, he's called the Duke, but he's actually the sovereign. And notice he says, we've lent him our terror, line 19, dressed him with our love. Again, like a scarecrow. So, he's not really granting Angelo a lot of sort of sensible autonomy here. And you wonder, why is he doing this? And he refuses to tell him. Then Angelo turns up, and he says to Angelo, and this is a lovely bit of, it's something that's very common in Shakespeare. It's when a character says something to somebody else that they are confident the other person, out of their own vanity, self-regard, will interpret as praise, but which actually isn't necessarily praise at all if you look at it. Mm-hmm. So that it's a kind of way, it's a sneaky way of getting at somebody, of course.
Like if you say to somebody, Peter, you are one of a kind.
Exactly, yeah, that's right.
You interpret that as, oh, it's so great. It sounds like a compliment, but I might actually mean because nobody is as terrible as you are.
Exactly. So what he says is, Angelo, there is a kind of character in thy life, and that means both written character, so I can read you like a book, he's saying. The kind of character in thy life that to the observer doth thy history fully unfold. Great, I can read you like a book. What kind of a book is it? Is it a good book? Is it a bad book? He doesn't say, because he's confident that Angelo, as a kind of narcissist, will assume that he's talking about a good book. And then he goes and tell him that thyself and my belongings not thine own so proper as to waste thyself upon thy virtues, they on thee. That he's not giving his virtues forth, if you like. He's hoarding. He's a kind of hoarding character that's not sharing. He's hiding his light under a bushel. He's like the bad servant in the parable of the talents, who buries his talent in the ground and doesn't go and invest it on the short-term stock market, for example, which is what he's supposed to do. So again, it's an interesting little insight. Even the Duke has some insight into Angelo.
It's also kind of an interesting little brag, because the Duke seems to suspect that Angelo will fall. Angelo is this kind of perfect, too good to be true guy. You know, you can leave the money in front of him, he's not going to take any. He's above suspicion. And yet, as we'll see later in the play, he falls and he falls hard. But the Duke's already kind of setting this up here, like, I see you, I read you, even if you don't see yourself.
That's right, and he says later on, more reasons we shall supply, but this, he says, we shall see if power change purpose, what our seamers be. So what he's doing is, in a sense, testing Angelo. And this is a grotesquely irresponsible thing to do, because this is the welfare of the state.
He's giving him the power of these people's lives.
You'd never get this experiment past an ethics committee in a university, for example. So the Duke turns out to be a very interesting, complex figure, of course, in his own right.
Interestingly, if we look at line 48, when Angelo responds, he responds in humility and says, "Now, good my lord, let there be some more test of my metal,
Yes.
before so noble and great a figure be stamped upon it, before you give me the crown, before you make me the ruler." Like, he's kind of calling the Duke out on this irresponsibility in a weird kind of
Yes, he
humble
is.
way,
Yeah,
and saying, "Test me before you give me all this power."
yeah, yeah. Test made of my metal. Metal, of course, when we say metal with two T's and an L-E, it's like exactly the same word. It's just a metaphor for metal. What are you made of? Like Goneril says, Reagan says, "I'm made of that self-metal as my sister." And so that's actually quite an interesting question. Is he the true gold he appears to be, above corruption, above rust, or is he in fact just kind of iron painted over with gold?
And do you think at this point he is genuinely being humble and saying, "Whoa, test me first," or do you think there's a kind of an arrogance here,
I think
wanting to appear so
yes,
humble?
I think so. I think that's probably what it is. I mean, he's a complex character. Again, there are no baddies. Well, not so, okay. Not in this play, though. This play is much more complex than that. So there may be a tiny little corner of self-doubt in there, but it's only a tiny little corner. Soon goes away.
Yeah. He's happy to take the power.
That's right. That's right. Incidentally, one of the things that I like to write about and so on is meter, is the rhythm of the verse. And this play is quite interesting for meter. One thing I'll draw your attention to from time to time are what's called rests, which are missing beats in the line. And Shakespeare puts in rests to cue action. So he's basically saying where there's a rest, some sort of gesture is involved, so that the physical gesture carries the beat that otherwise is in the language. And there's a lovely example here. Angelo says, "Let there be some more test made of my metal, before so noble and so great a figure be stamped upon it," like a coin. You know, only the king can make coins. He stamps an image on the coin. But, you know, is the coin worth the image stamped on it? Or is it, you know, that's the question. Be stamped upon it, no more evasion, says the Duke. So at this point the Duke does something. He holds up his hand. He does something rather peremptory, because it's written into the line. And you can miss that kind of thing if you're not kind of attuned to it, I suppose. "No more evasion, we have with a leavened and prepared choice proceeded to you." So, you know, he's thought about this. But again, he doesn't say what the leavening and the preparation is. We've given it some thought. What kind of thought was it? What's he actually up to? And of course he doesn't tell us. Then he incidentally, this is a tiny thing, but it's worth mentioning. To some extent, and we'll see whether or not you think this is a kind of complementary thing, the Duke is a little bit of a parody, an image of King James I. And one because what the idea of him slipping privily away at line 67, "I love the people, but not like to stage me to their eyes. I don't relish well their loud applause," and so on. That is copying James. James was like that. So it's a sign.
James is the King of England at this time.
Yes.
So Shakespeare is in England writing this play,
That's right.
and James is the monarch.
And indeed, Shakespeare is one of the king's men. To be an actor, to be a player, you had to be a servant of some great lord, otherwise you were a rogue and a vagabond. So he is expecting, well, again, it's exactly this business where the vain person will take an image of themselves as complimentary. They won't look at it too closely. Where it may not be, which means that Shakespeare actually is playing a rather dangerous game here. If he thinks James is sufficiently astute to see that this portrait of him is complicated, let's put it that way, he may not be too pleased about that. But the interesting thing is, if you read criticism of this play, criticism particularly from most of the 20th century, you'll find that critics admire the Duke enormously as a godlike figure, a figure who comes in who solves problems, like, you know, descending in a chariot from heaven. And I think a close reading of the play renders such an attitude. It strikes me it's the only way you could really believe that is if you just read the Wikipedia summary of the plot and didn't actually read the play.
I think that's interesting because often when people do tell you how great they are, sometimes you fall for it and it takes you a while to realise, like, actually you're all talk. And,
that's right.
And we do see this with the Duke, and I mean this part here, these lines, I really do love this part. It starts at about line 65 or 66, so there are no set exact lines. Every edition will be slightly different, but you can find the lines around that area where he says, "I'll privily away. I love the people, but do not like to stage me to their eyes. Though it do well, I do not relish well their loud applause and aves vehement. Nor do I think them out of safe discretion that does affect it." So he's like, oh, you know, like, it's fine, but like, I don't want to be centre stage. I don't want to be clapped by everyone. How embarrassing. I'll just
I'm a
go
modest
out.
man.
Exactly,
Yes.
like, you know, and don't trust people who want all that kind of stuff, which is interesting considering how at the end of the play, when everything comes together and justice is supposedly served, the Duke gathers everybody together and creates this huge fanfare and spectacle so that he can perform to people. He who claimed at the start of the play, I do not like to make a big show of myself in front of the people.
Exactly. He creates this whole drama, which he is centre stage.
Yeah,
In fact, he plays two different parts. He plays,
Yeah, exactly. And there's so much kind of fanfare and unnecessary drama that goes along with it.
Yeah.
And so I think critics forget this sometimes, but he claims at the start of the play, I don't like the limelight, I don't like the spotlight.
And the interesting thing is that I think he probably believes that because he believes all sorts of stuff about himself that the play shows to be quite false. So he really is kind of self-deceived in this. He thinks he's a humble, unassuming, modest kind of a person.
Scholar, a gentleman, and a
soldier.
soldier.
That's right.
Okay, so we'll see if this description of himself holds throughout the play.
Quite. The next scene, the first part is comedy, which we needn't spend a lot of time on. It's all good fun, I suppose, although sometimes Shakespeare's comedy doesn't quite sell well.
Yeah, sometimes the kind of drunken fun doesn't translate well across time.
Well, it sometimes depends. I mean, sometimes productions can make this quite amusing. But of course, there are the usual jokes about syphilis in here, which we'll let you work out for yourselves. But I'll give you a clue. It's about velvet. Three-piled velvet. Syphilis makes your hair fall out. Well, syphilis used to make your hair fall out. I don't know what it does nowadays.
Is there any important meaning for our purposes that we need to draw from Act 1, Scene 2?
Not madly, no, I don't think so, except that it's an image of Vienna as a place of, well, people having fun, let's be honest. They're drinking, and, you know, it is also a brothel, this particular house run by Mistress Overdone. So people are not being strict and puritanical and repressed and so on. So it's a different
contrast to Angelo.
Yes, exactly. So Angelo sees people having fun as a real problem, as indeed the Puritans did. Somebody once remarked that the reason Puritans hated bear baiting wasn't because it was cruel to bears, but because people had fun. So we see a bit of a jolly scene, and then it's interrupted because Shakespeare loves to change moods with with Claudia being brought in as a prisoner. And you can see that the people in the pub are incredulous about the nature of this offence. So, for example, enter Pompey. Now, this is prose, so I don't know where your break will be. It's about line 77 for me. What is it for you, enter Pompey?
That is about line 82.
Yeah, so because prose doesn't break up neatly into lines, I'm sorry about that, but we won't spend much time on prose, so we much prefer the poetry. But in comes Pompey, who's an interesting character, we shall see. He comes up a lot later. He's the tapster. He's the person who serves the beer and the ale in the pub/brothel. Hannah, what's the news with you? Yonder man is carried to prison. Mistress Overdone, the mistress of the brothel, says, well, what has he done? A woman, says Pompey, tersely. And notice Miss Overdone says, but what's his offence? You know, okay, yeah, sure, he's shagged a girl, but what's his offence? I don't understand. So the idea that fornication, if we give it this horrible word that Angelo loves to use, the idea that fornication is an offence, let alone a capital offence, it's just not on the radar. It just doesn't register with her. So what's his offence? Pompey says groping for trout in a peculiar river, which is, I suppose,
euphemism.
You could
Rather grotesque one.
rather gross, really, in a way. And Mistress Overdone says, what, is there a maid with child by him? And Pompey says, no, but there's a woman with maid by him, very typically Shakespearean wordplay there. Of course, she's not a maid once she's become successful until she becomes impregnated.
Maid means virgin.
Yes. So the point of all this is how ordinary people view this notion of a law against fornication, and they think it's just absurd. It makes no sense at all. Which is an important corrective. You know, if we just had the view of the higher ups, who might think, well, yeah, why not? It's different times, they did things differently then. But really, they weren't that different from us, people in this period.
And it's not like it's some kind of parking fine offence or something.
Yes.
It's imprisonment
Yes.
and ultimately death.
Getting your head chopped
So
off, you know,
yeah.
that's kind of like a big thing, really. On the whole. So Claudio is brought in. We probably don't need to say too much about this part, though we do notice that Claudio does show an interesting degree of relatively mature self-knowledge in this scene. He says, for example, he's asked Lucio, who is a very interesting character. We have lots to say about Lucio. He's fun.
It's interesting that we meet him in a brothel for the first time.
Yes, that's right. Lucio says, why how now, Claudio? Whence comes this restraint? It's about line 116 for me. It's after the longish stage direction into provost and officers with Claudio and Juliet, Lucio and the two gentlemen. And Claudio says, from too much liberty, my Lucio, liberty. A surfeit is the mother of much fast, so every scope by the immoderate use turns to restraint. Our natures do pursue like rats of ravin down them, proper bane, a thirsty evil, and when we drink we die. So that shows quite interesting sophistication. It's actually kind of theological sophistication. The first part of his speech is in a sense referring to the famous remark of Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica, which is a kind of compendium of medieval theology from the 13th century. The idea that every disordered soul becomes its own punishment, that sin is a natural consequence of that punishment is a natural consequence of sin because you create the punishment through the sin.
I think we can see this more obviously in some sins than others.
Yes.
So don't become an alcoholic, don't get drunk regularly. We can see why that's not a good idea.
Exactly.
And so it's different from the idea that God tells us to do things randomly, and that if we break one of his meaningless rules, we get punished by him.
Yeah.
It's the idea that God's telling us not to do things that will harm us.
Exactly. So if you go back to Dante's Inferno, Dante's vision of hell, written in the early 14th century, you find that almost always the sin is like a natural outgrowth or an ironic comment on the punishment. I beg your pardon, is a kind of ironic comment on the sin itself. So that and this is actually important because we'll come back to this briefly. But the incontinent, the lovers who have given themselves up to desire, who've not restrained themselves, and of course this is in a sense what's happened with Claudio and Juliet, are represented as being blown about on the winds of hell, as though because they've surrendered control, they no longer have control, and so they've become a punishment to themselves. Their disorder has produced this punishment. And what's very interesting is that I know this is kind of by the by, but it's fun. Shakespeare clearly knew his Dante because when Claudio is talking about the prospect of death, he says, or to be blown with restless violence round about this pendant world. So he knew that part of the Inferno.
He's Dante, because if he's being killed as a fornicator, supposedly, even though it really is just a technicality, that's the part of hell that he would go to, according to Dante. He would be blown around.
That's right. And in Dante, it's not the kind of horrific punishment you get for things like violence and fraud. Fraud is the stuff that's really punished in Dante. It's a kind of minor punishment in a way, I suppose.
Comparably.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they're together forever, Francesca and... Anyway, that's by the by. What I want to point out simply here is that Claudio shows self-knowledge and a degree of sophistication. He talks about, drinking our own evil, if you like, pursuing the rest rather than down their proper bane. He's referring to that fundamental idea of concupiscence, the idea that fallen creatures are kind of naturally disposed to sin against their own good, if you like. That they're not actually acting in terms of their own good. They're drinking a poison that will kill them. Again, in the same sense that every disordered soul becomes its own punishment. So he's in a stark contrast to.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I think.
He's showing such humility here. I mean,
Yeah.
he has the right to say, like, this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
My wife and I are practically married. There's just this final legal technicality, and now I'm being dragged to prison. This is ridiculous. And yet he shows a humility. He brings it on himself. Why is this being done to you? Because of my own licentiousness, of my own sinfulness. Which, yes, is in contrast to characters like the Duke and Angelo, who see themselves as so much more than they are.
Exactly. I mean, he does, of course, point out that it's a little unfair later on, but he begins with this.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that he also shows a degree of sophistication about why this is happening. So, line 146 or so, trying to explain to Lucio why he's being punished. He says it could be the fault of glimpse of newness. In other words, it's kind of mistakes that people make when they're new in the job. Or that the body public be a horse, line 148, whereon the governor doth ride, who newly in the seat, that it may know he can command, lets it straight feel the spur. In other words, he's suggesting this might be an act of purely political significance, nothing to do with justice, but making a kind of public example so that other people will obey the law, if you like. Sending a signal, sending a message.
Kind of like you don't want to get pulled over by a cop on their first day, I guess, because they are going to fine you.
That's right. A sort of Machiavellian reason, which is very insightful, of course. And we'll come back again to that whole notion. Machiavelli, the early 16th century Italian commentator, who was the first to suggest the modern notion that politics is somehow outside or beside morality, which of course is a very foreign idea to the way Elizabethans generally thought, because for them justice is a function of the king. The king dispenses justice, and it's a kind of God-given ideal. Like it may fall down in places and then not work, but the intention must always be the pursuit of justice, of crime and punishment and so on. So again, Claudio is showing a certain degree of sophistication in perceiving this Machiavellian. In other words, when the ruler does something, not because it's right, not because it's just, but because it's useful, and what we find is that, again, I'm foreshadowing here, but the Duke very much sees himself as a sacramental ruler who rules according to justice, and yet every single thing he does in this play is about policy. It's about Machiavellian policy, about restoring order in the state, about reasserting his own power. So, the scene at the end that we mentioned before, it's both self-display, he's having a great time being the centre of attention, but it's also got this political purpose, this theatre of politics, of reasserting his own power and authority as at the centre of the state. So, well, I mean, the point I'm making, I suppose, is that Claudio is really interesting contrast, and we'll see that his wife Juliet is also a very interesting contrast to the main characters in the play. Now, the end of this scene is very interesting because he has a request to Lucio. He asks Lucio to get his sister Isabella to intercede. And as I said in our little preamble, Isabella is a novice nun. And he says to him, and this is, if you can't find it, it's the very end of the scene, so it should be easy to find. About line 168 for me.
About line 178 for me.
Oh, wow.
The line I think you're going to say.
Oh, right. Well, he says, "This day my sister should the cloister empty." Well, he says, "I prithee, Lucio, do me this kind service. This day my sister should the cloister enter, and there receive her approbation." So she's a novice nun, she hasn't yet been crowned. What do you do to a nun?
Oh gosh, not ordained.
No.
I can't think.
Well,
Well, she hasn't taken her
taken
final
the
vows.
vow.
Yeah,
No.
she hasn't made her profession.
No, exactly. "Acquaint her with the danger of my estate, implore her in my voice that she make friends with the strict deputy." She make friends with the strict deputy. An interestingly, slightly ambiguous reference
Make
there.
friends.
"Bid herself assay him. I have great hope in that." Now, assay is a very interesting word because it kind of means like a try, have a go. Like an essay is having a go and writing about a topic. But it's also what people who weigh gold do. An assayer is a person who measures the purity or the adulteration of gold. So, is he the gold he seems, or is he corruptible in whatever way? And there's a strong sense that corruptibility might not be monetary, but maybe sexual. Who knows?
We shall see.
So there's a very interesting undercurrent to his speech here, because he says, "For in her youth there is a prone and speechless dialect, such as move men." Prone, facing forward, face down, apparently submissive, apparently humble, but a speechless dialect that moves men. She has a kind of charisma.
Oh yeah, I love these lines so much because he's on the surface talking about her intellect. He's like, she's smart, she's pure, she is strong, she's about to enter the monastery. If he can call, this is kind of his one phone call. He doesn't want to call on a lawyer or anything. He wants to call on his sister, get her to test him, like she's good enough to tell, to see what this guy is made of. And then the next more subtle reason is in her youth. So in her youthfulness, there is a prone and speechless dialect such as move men.
Yes.
So because it's not verbal, he's essentially saying she's really attractive. She can get men do what she wants.
Yes.
When she bats her eyelids. And then he says, besides.
Yes, besides.
Yeah.
It's so interesting there, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not the same thing. She has
Yes.
prosperous art when she will play with reason and discourse, and well she can persuade. So this dialect with which she moves men is not her rhetoric. She's very persuasive. She's very good with words. But there's also this other thing. She has a speechless dialect that moves men.
Yes, so it's kind of double whammy.
Which sums her up quite nicely, which sets up the introduction of her character quite well.
That's right.
Perhaps that's a good place to
Oh, right.
end this episode.
Yes, I suppose so. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Good.
We've been introduced to a range of characters
Yes.
into the setting of this
Yeah.
play.
Yeah. Excellent.
Is there anything you want to add before we?
Just the word art here means the art of rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech, essentially. Though of course it could have other possible meanings. There are different kinds of arts that could persuade. So it's quite interesting that Claudio isn't saying openly what he wants from her. And it's interesting because Lucio is not somebody. Lucio isn't likely to be shocked by the idea that maybe she could seduce him, although she's a nun. So maybe, well.
But that's interesting as well because Claudio himself, the brother, is perhaps not being honest with himself about what he wants from his sister.
That's
He's
right.
like, send her. She's really smart and really clever.
Yeah.
And men tend to do what she wants. But it's
Exactly.
because she's smart. I would never put her in this position.
Of course not. No, because she's going to become a nun. I wouldn't dream of it.
Yeah.
Yes.
But make friends with him.
Yes, exactly.
See, test him.
Yeah.
Test him.
Yeah. Because,
how-
so Claudia, we say, Claudia in a sense is somewhat above the other characters in terms of self-knowledge, but no character is somehow free entirely from this self-deception, this self-delusion, and that's the interesting point that he's making here.
Yeah. So on the surface, it's very simple.
Yeah.
Sent her in to plead for me with theological and clever word stuff.
Yes.
But already we're seeing this undercurrent here.
Yeah, and the beautiful key is the word besides, as though that were kind of extra. Her being a fine talker, which is
That's not the primary reason,
no,
is it?
no. But and for a Renaissance audience, the power of speech to persuade is a very important thing. It's what you learnt it at school, you learnt it at university, and so on. And it ought to be what's front and centre of his speech here. She's a pleader, she's a lawyer for him almost. But no, what's front and centre is something else, which he doesn't quite name.
And then her verbal persuasiveness is an afterthought.
An afterthought, exactly. Good, well there we are. That
Right.
first two scenes, that's a good place to pause.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, see you in our next episode.
Excellent.